Okay. Sorry about that back and forth. So we're going to do 22 this morning, speciation, or afternoon or evening, whenever you're... okay, so... is the process by which one species splits into two or more species. Now, we all have kind of a general concept of what a species is, right? It's a different type of organism, right? This horse is a different species than this bird is. But the interesting and somewhat confusing thing is that there is actually no single definition of species. Rather, there are several what we call species concepts. And the species concept that you use depends somewhat on the characteristics of the organism and also what just kind of your goals as an investigator are. So, what is a species? Well, the species concept that we are going to be using is known as the biological species concept, or we'll just call it the BSC for short. So there are other species concepts that we'll get into later, but this is probably, at least for our purposes, the most useful and probably the most widely used species concept. So according to the biological species concept, a species is a group of populations that are capable of interbreeding, that can interbreed and produce viable, that just means living and healthy, viable, fertile offspring. Okay, so these are populations whose members can interbreed and produce offspring that are both viable and themselves fertile, capable of having progeny there, so their offspring can have offspring. And they do not produce offspring with other populations. Okay, so let's say that these are two different populations of penguins, right? This, and you can see they look a little different. This one has some different facial features. So populations of this species of penguin all interbreed with each other and produce offspring, but cannot interbreed and produce offspring with this species of penguin. Okay, that's what makes them different species. These two cannot produce viable offspring. So reproductive isolation, what we call reproductive isolation, is the key to the biological species concept. Reproductive isolation means that two organisms can no longer exchange genes. So there's no gene flow. We've cut off gene flow. So for the biological species concept, reproductive isolation is key to the formation of species. So this is kind of key to speciation, is the formation of some kind of reproductive isolation that keeps interbreeding from happening. So there are two sort of types. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. So there are two types of reproductive barriers that can cause reproductive isolation. So reproductive barriers that can cause reproductive isolation. We have what we call prezygotic isolation and postzygotic isolation. Okay, so a zygote is the first cell that forms after fertilization. So just by looking at the words, we can see that a prezygotic barrier is going to prevent fertilization from occurring in the first place, and a postzygotic barrier is going to happen after fertilization has occurred, but it's going to somehow prevent hybrid zygotes from either forming correctly or reproducing from, we'll say, viability or fertility. Right? It either makes them inviable, they don't live, or they're infertile, they can't reproduce. And by the way, when I say the word hybrid, I'm talking about an organism that is the result of two different types of species mating. Okay, so those are our two main types of reproductive barriers. So let's sort of think about these a little more deeply. So prezygotic barriers. So they're all kind of written up here, so I won't rewrite them. So one of the first types of prezygotic barriers, I'm going to get my little pointer pen out if it'll let me here. Bear with me here a second. Okay. There we go. So several different types of prezygotic here. Habitat isolation. So habitat isolation is just you live in different places. Live in different places. And the fact that you live in different places means that you breed in different places, so you do not encounter each other and start to breed. So let's take, for example, these two snakes here. So one species is aquatic and one species is terrestrial. So they are isolated by habitat, and thus so they don't encounter each other and interbreed. And over time, also, when two populations never encounter each other and never interbreed, this will also tend to lead toward genetic incompatibilities to reproduction. So that is habitat isolation. There's also something called temporal isolation. Temporal means time. So breed at different times. So this could be different times of, this could be day versus night. This could be spring versus fall. So it could be seasonal, and this could be yeah, that's all I can think of. Day versus night, different times of day, different times of year. Different times of life. That was what I was thinking about. Different times of life. It could be, they could breed very early in life or later in life. Sorry for my brain cramp. Okay. So, for example, these spotted skunks, one is diurnal, breeding during the day, doing its thing during the day, and one is nocturnal, breeding at night, and so that temporal isolation keeps them separated from each other. We can also have what's called behavioral isolation. So behavioral isolation is where some type of courtship ritual or other behavior is necessary for mating, and typically for the females to accept the males. So in these blue-footed boobies we're seeing here, this little dance the male is doing is necessary for the female to recognize this as being the same species. This is the male I want to mate with. So this behavioral adaptation keeps them mating only with themselves and not with other populations. We can also have mechanical isolation. Okay, so this is where the mechanics just don't work out. So in mechanical isolation, a morphological difference makes sperm transfer impossible. Right, so we cannot get the sperm from the male to the female. And this, prevents fertilization. So, and kind of an interesting example, I think, here are these two snails. And one of these snails, their shell coils in a clockwise direction, so literally the coiling of this shell, and the other one coils counterclockwise. Because of this difference, they cannot align themselves in such a way that the male's genitalia can successfully transfer sperm to the female, and so they stay separated from each other. The final type of prezygotic barrier is known as gametic isolation. And then in gametic isolation, the sperm, for a variety of reasons, is not compatible with the egg. So the sperm reaches the egg, but it cannot penetrate the egg. And a great example of this can be found in sea urchins. So sea urchins, being sessile, just release their eggs and sperm to the water, where they will, hopefully find each other. And the way different species of sea urchins stay isolated from each other is that should the wrong species of sperm reach an egg, the proteins on the egg will be incompatible with the surface proteins of the sperm, and it will not allow it to penetrate the egg and not allow fertilization to happen. So there's also something called postzygotic isolation, right? So this is where something keeps a hybrid offspring from being either viable or fertile. So reduced hybrid viability means that the hybrid is basically very frail, perhaps development doesn't complete totally. So in reduced hybrid viability, development incomplete, organism is frail or unhealthy, and oftentimes they don't actually live to a reproductive age at all. So here we have a hybrid salamander. So this is a hybrid of two different species of salamander, but it is very frail. It doesn't develop very well. It almost never survives. So it's so because of these reasons, we consider those salamander parents different species, and we say they have not successfully bred. We also can get something called reduced hybrid fertility. So that is another. So this is where we have offspring, the hybrid offspring, are sterile, meaning they can't have babies themselves. So the offspring of a horse and a donkey is a mule, and a mule is a perfectly robust, healthy animal. However, it is incapable of reproducing itself. So it's considered an evolutionary dead end, and so we consider horses and donkeys separate species. Sort of a kind of interesting one, the final postzygotic barrier, is something called hybrid breakdown. Hybrid breakdown is where the initial hybrid is both viable and fertile. So I'll write it down. Initial, we'll call the F1 hybrid, is viable and fertile. But the hybrid's babies, right, so the offspring of the hybrid, what we call the F2 generation, is either inviable, otherwise frail, not able to compete, or sometimes sterile. Oops, if I could spell. That'd be good. So a good example here, we're looking at a couple examples. So here's hybrid, some kind of hybrid grass, and in the F1 generation, it's okay. You know, it's able to create offspring itself. Offspring in the F2 generation, the babies of the babies, is very inviable, doesn't compete, doesn't survive. Another interesting example is in mosquitoes. So in some mosquitoes, hybrids, if we have a hybrid species, the F1s are okay, but the F2s, the babies of the hybrids, their genitalia do not form correctly, making them incapable of mating. So basically it means this hybrid breakdown is the idea that later down the road we start to have problems that keep this hybrid from sort of existing. So we say, okay, then the parent species we will consider separate species because they did not successfully interbreed in the long term. Okay, so the biological species concept is one type of species concept, and it can be very useful, especially in the context of talking about speciation. However, there are some situations where it just doesn't apply well. And one of those situations is when we have fossil species, right? If we know a species only from the fossil record, there is no way to ascertain whether or not two individual fossil organisms were reproductively isolated, right? So we can't determine reproductive isolation. There's no way to do it. Another place where the biological species concept really doesn't work out is with species that reproduce asexually only, right? So asexual species, right, like bacteria or something, you can't even apply this concept, right? They only reproduce asexually, so it doesn't work at all. Another situation where it doesn't really work out that well is situations where we have what we would consider to be, for lack of a better word, a good species that actually does exhibit natural hybridization of viable offspring in nature. So a great example of this is that a grizzly bear and a polar bear interbreed in nature, and my pen is messed up, interbreed in nature and produce what we call polar bear. I know, it is the cutest thing that would rip your face off. Polar bear is perfectly viable. It is capable of producing offspring. So biological species concept, it suggests we should consider polar bear separate species. Most people would say, no, grizzly bears and polar bears are different species. So that kind of is an area where it's funky. And there are some options when the biological species doesn't really work well for us. And one species that we also use when the biological species is problematic is the ecological species concept. Morphological concept. So in the morphological concept, species are identified by body or other structures. Basically, their morphology. This works really well for fossil or asexual organisms. Right? It's kind of the only way we can do it. And of course, now that we have this to us, in some cases we can also apply sequence alignment and things like that. Another species concept useful is what we call the species concept. So the lineage species concept considers a species as one branch on the tree of life, which has a history starting at speciation. Now, certainly, this species, right, if we think of a species as a lineage existing, it could branch off into separate species, right? But this kind of concept works well with kind of the polar bear situation, right? So we would still consider the polar bear and the grizzly bear branches on the tree of life. And there could be subdivision, but that doesn't kind of make a polar bear or a grizzly bear not a species in its own right. So sometimes the lineage species also works well. But I would say, generally speaking, in a biology class, we will almost always be using the biological species concept, and that's, that's what we're going to be talking about and what we're going to be using as we go on in this lecture. All right, so we are going to take a break now, and I'll pick up in another video. As always, feel free to contact me if you have any questions whatsoever.